Is everything clear so far? Right. Okay. Now, this is price elasticity of demand, which is not contrary to the law of demand. Law of demand says higher the price, lower the demand, lower the price, higher the demand, right? So that is what law of demand says. And this will be true for any product in the world, like literally any product, whether that be a food item, whether that be clothing, whether that be shoes, whether that be car, whether that be gold, whether that be anything in the world, right? It's always inverse relationship. But what we are interested in knowing when we look at price elasticity of demand is that how much is the response in demand due to change in price? Is it more or is it less? If it's more, it's known as more elastic, and that's why we say more responsive. If demand is less elastic, it's known as less responsive. Now, the way we calculate price elasticity of demand, now we are looking at this formula for the first time, so we will pay special attention to this. Percentage change, so this delta, this triangle we use in maths to show change. Percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. Another thing that I told you over here is that price, the variable that's in the denominator, right? So if it's A over B, so A is in the numerator, B is in the denominator, B has to be independent variable, right? That changes due to some of its own factors. And this B, change in B is causing a change in B is causing a change in A, which is the dependent variable. Is everyone clear on this? Any confusion so far, you can ask me. Okay. Now let's first look at how do we calculate PED, right? So let's say we have two columns over here, right? So we have price of the good, let me write down the full form. So we have price of the good, and then corresponding to that price, we have quantity demanded, right? So let's take the example of, let's say, Coke, right? So if the price of Coke per bottle is 50 rupees, right? So if the price of Coke per bottle, price of per bottle Coke is 50 rupees, let's say a person was consuming 100 bottles per month, 100 bottles per month. Now, if the price decreases to, let's say, 30 rupees per bottle, let's say the quantity demanded, as we know, will increase, and that jumps to from, let's say, 100 to 150 bottles per month for any consumer, X, Y, Z, D, right? Now, this being said, how do we calculate the percentage change in demand and how do we calculate the percentage change in price? Why do we need to do that? Because we are calculating price elasticity of demand. So what we'll do exactly is, first we'll calculate this, how much is the change in demand, and then we'll calculate how much is the change in price, and then we'll divide the two values to find the answer of PED. So let's do an example, because then we'll be better able to understand. Okay, now students, exactly how do we calculate the percentage change? You would know from your O-levels maths class that percentage change is new quantity of whatever variable we are calculating the percentage change for, new value minus old value divided by old value into 100. So what are we doing? New value minus old value divided by old value into 100. So that is your percentage change. Easy, we got on this? Okay. Now, in this case, what we knew that initially this much was the price and this much was quantity, and then price dropped down to 30 rupees per bottle, and now this is the new quantity. So if you have to calculate, let's say first calculate the percentage change in demand. So what will be the new quantity in this case? So if price is decreasing from 50 rupees to 30 rupees, what is the new quantity in demand? Right? So we'll do step by step, Zohan. Students, have a look at this. So if initially the price was 50, so corresponding to that price of 50 rupees was your quantity of 100 units. Now, when the price has dropped from 50 rupees per bottle to 30 rupees per bottle, so your new quantity is now this one, because this is the new price, and corresponding to the new price will be your new quantity. So new quantity 150 minus old quantity, which is 100, divided by old quantity, which is 100 into 100 percentage change. So that will give you, this directly gets cancelled out, and that will give you a percentage change of 50%, which means there's a 50% increase in the demand for Coke. There's 50% for this person, there's 50% increase in the demand for Coke. Is everyone clear so far? Okay, now moving on. Similarly, we'll calculate the percentage change in price. Now, what's the new price? Minus old price divided by old price into 100. As simple as that. Now, have a look at this. New price was 30 because price has moved from here to here. 30 minus old was 50, divided by old is 50 into 100. Any confusion so far, students? right? So that will give you negative 20 in the numerator. Then you will have 50 into 100. So you do the simple maths, right? These two get cancelled out. So it will be 200 over 5. So 200 over 5. So 520 is this. So negative 40%. How much is the change in price, students? Negative 40%. Now, what do we need to do? So this was the percentage change in demand. This was the percentage change in demand, and this is the percentage change in price. Now, all you have to do is to just put one value on top of the other, right? So percentage change in demand is 50%. Percentage change in price is negative 40%, right? So what is the overall value? Think about this. Percentage gets cancelled out with the percentage, right? So that would be 50 divided by 40. So it will give you negative 1.1 over 4 is how much? 25, negative 1.25. Is this correct? Is my calculation correct? Negative 1.25. Perfect. Absolutely. Great. Now, is everything clear so far? Khatija and Khizr, is everything clear so far? If there's any confusion, please ask me. Right? So we just use the simple maths to calculate these two values, percentage change in demand and percentage change in price. Now, then what we did next was just to plug in the values in this formula to find the final answer, right? So it was 50% change in demand and negative 40% change in price. So this gets canceled out, and then we simplified the value, and that gave you negative 1.25. Now let's interpret. Now let's look at what this negative 1.25 shows us. Now, first thing, why is this negative? Why is this negative? Why is price elasticity of demand negative? There has to be a reason for that, right? And the reason is what we have already discussed. Inverse relationship between price and demand. Yes or no? Did I tell you that this is something that is always true? Inverse relationship between price and demand is something that always holds true. Relationship between price and demand. Any confusion so far, students? Now, this being said, whenever one variable is increasing, the other variable has to decrease. Whenever one variable is increasing, students, the other variable has to decrease. So think about this. When this goes up, price goes up, quantity will decrease, and vice versa. When price will go down, quantity will increase. So the negative sign, exactly, I'm coming towards one. So the negative sign just shows the negative relationship between two variables, right? So let me also write this down so that you never forget. The negative sign with PED value just shows the negative relationship not the negative, just shows the inverse would be a better word, just shows the inverse relationship between price and demand. Any confusion so far? Just shows the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So what it actually shows that this will always be true. So the negative sign with PED value will always be there, but you don't have to worry about it because we know, right, that this is because of the law of demand. This negative sign in the PED value is because of negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. So it will always be there. Yes or no? Right? So that is what it signifies, that there's inverse relationship between price and demand. So when one variable goes up, as I was showing you over here, the other variable goes down. If price goes up, quantity demanded will decrease, and vice versa. If price is going down, quantity demanded will increase. So that is what it shows. Easy? Can we move on? Okay. Now the next thing that you have to look for to interpret this value. So the next thing that you have to look at to interpret this value is that whether 1.25 is greater than 1 or less than 1. Now, ignoring the negative sign, tell me if 1.25 is greater than 1 or less than 1. We know it's greater than 1. Yes or no? One, right. So technically what it actually shows is that for 1% change in price, there is 1.25% change in demand. For 1% change in price, because what was in the denominator? Price. What was in the numerator? Demand. So for 1% change in price, there has been 1.25% change in demand. How many of you got this? Overall, the value was 1.25. Students, the overall value of PED was 1.25. Now, if I just write it down like this, is there any difference if I've written two values like this, 1.25, or I write it down as 1.25 divided by 1? Is there any difference between the two? Right? First, tell me this. Is there? Khadija? Is there any difference between the two numbers? And the answer is no. Exactly. There's no. So whether I write 10 like this or I write 10 divided by 1. I mean, it's absolutely no difference because 10 is 10 and 10 divided by 1 is also 10, right? But why have I written this PED value like this? Because to tell you that let's assume that there is price in the, right? As per the formula, we know there was price in the denominator. So for 1% change in price, there is 1.25% change in demand. For 1% change in price, there is 1.25% change in demand. Yes or no? Right? So what it technically tells you that change in demand is more than proportionate, right? Let me write this down because this is the language that we'll be using moving forward. Change in demand is more than proportionate. Now, I'll also tell you what more than proportionate means. Demand is more than proportionate than change in price. Is more than proportionate than change in product price. Okay, now think about this. Whenever PED value is greater than 1, students, it shows that the change in demand is more than proportionate. Now, some of you might be confused that what does proportionate means? Proportionate means that whatever is changing in the denominator, same as the change in the numerator. So if it's 10% divided by 10%, then these two are proportionate. This is proportionate. Students, are you following me? As per the mathematical terminology, you'll call this to be proportionate because the two numbers are exactly the same. 10 divided by 10 is proportionate. 20 divided by 20 would also be proportionate. 20% change in the numerator, 20% change in the denominator, it's also proportionate. Yes or no? But what is more than proportionate? More than proportionate would be when in the numerator we have a bigger value compared to the value in the denominator. So if in the numerator we have a value bigger than the value in the denominator, this is known as more than proportionate. How many of you got this? This is known as more than proportionate, right? And similarly, an opposite example would be when the change in the denominator is greater than the change in the numerator. So if in the numerator we have 40% and in the denominator we have 80%. Now this is less than proportionate because in the numerator you can see it's smaller compared to the change in the denominator. So this thing is known as less than proportionate. Any confusion so far? Students, please tell me, because this is really important that we completely understand this, because when we move forward from it, it will be a little confusing. Less than proportionate. Easy? Good? Zohan? Khadija? Khizr? Okay, perfect. Right? Now let's come back. Now, since this value was 1.25, which ignoring the negative sign. Okay, another thing that I want to tell you. Yes, so Zohan, answering your question, whenever you have to interpret the value of price elasticity of demand, you will always ignore the negative sign. whenever you have to interpret the value of price elasticity of demand, you will always ignore the negative sign. Why? Because that only shows the inverse relationship between price and demand, nothing else. So first thing that you need to know that PED will always be negative, as I told you, right? The negative sign with PED just shows the inverse relationship between price and demand. So after ignoring the negative sign, what's the next thing that you have to? So you ignore this. So the next thing that you have to look at is whether the value is bigger than 1, equal to 1, or less than 1. If the value is bigger than 1, how do we interpret it? We interpret this as that the change in demand is more than proportionate than the change in price. So that means it's more elastic. That means it is more elastic because demand is changing more than the change in price. Students, is this making sense? Demand is changing more than the change in price, so it is more elastic, right? Now, if the value would have been this, is this more than proportionate change in demand compared to price, or is this less than proportionate change in demand compared to price, or what? Let's interpret this. Let's interpret this value. Students, first of all, tell me, what's the first thing that we need to do? First thing that you have to do if you come across a value. So let's say a question says that this is the price elasticity of demand for product A, or let's say food, right? Or anything. Now you have to interpret the value of this, this price elasticity of demand value of this product food, right? So the first thing that you will do when you come across such a value, you ignore the negative sign, because negative sign just shows the inverse relationship between price and demand, which we have already discussed. Then you have to see whether the value is bigger than 1, greater than 1, or less than 1. Bigger than 1 means more than proportionate, less than 1 means less than proportionate, right? Yes or no? Because can I write 0.8 as 8 over 10? What is 8 over 10, by the way, students? If I write 0.8 or if I write 8 over 10, isn't this the same thing? Isn't this the same thing? Right? Are you getting me? Because 0.8 or 8 over 10, it's exactly the same, right? Yes or no? Khadija, are you following me? Now, for a value which is less than 1, it means change in demand is less than proportionate to the change in price. Is less than proportionate, like smaller, less than proportionate. I just told you, it means smaller. Is less than proportionate to change in price, and therefore it is less elastic. So this value of food item is less elastic, whereas for the other item, or less elastic or inelastic, and when it was greater than 1, it was more elastic. So this one was more elastic because the overall value was greater than 1, and this value is less than 1, so it is less elastic. Now, if you remember, now it would be a good time to kind of quickly recap what items have more elastic demand and what factors affect price elasticity of demand. So do you remember we talked about this, right? So what are the factors that affect price elasticity of demand? Can you help me recall and also give me some relevant examples? So factors affecting price elasticity of demand. So the first one was exactly, right? So whether it's a necessity or it's a luxury, right? So we know things that are necessities, right? Like food items, medicines, medical drugs, right? So that's necessity. And anything that's a luxury, which means like an expensive phone, expensive car, expensive laptop, right? That's a luxury. So if it's a necessity, you have to buy it no matter what, right? So what's the argument, students? Necessity is something that you have to buy no matter what. So even if food item is getting expensive, would you buy that? Right? You will, right? Fuel is getting expensive, but still a lot of people, you can't use your cars without fuel. So people have to buy it. So that's why the demand for fuel is inelastic, right? So that was the first thing. Whereas on the other hand, for luxury items, it's more elastic, right? Because if the price even increases a little bit, you might give up on demand. Even if the price, even if the price of a luxury item is increasing by a little bit, you might give up on that. right? Because it's not a necessity, right? As simple as that. You might want to save your money and spend it somewhere else. Now, the second factor that we said would affect the price elasticity of demand is simply the number of substitutes. So if you remember, we talked about this, we discussed this example where you are within school and you have only one canteen to buy your food from, right? So if that canteen is charging you or that cafe is charging you a higher price, you don't have any option but to buy from there. So you don't have a substitute. So if you have no substitute, it's less elastic. It technically becomes, when you have less substitutes, it basically becomes a necessity. You have to buy it. You have no other option. But when you have more option, you have more substitutes, then the demand is more elastic. Then the demand is more elastic. How many of you are following me, right? So number of substitutes is another thing. Then comes in what, right? So time duration. How, or you can also write this as how much urgent is something. If something is really urgent, I gave you this example that if you're traveling, if let's say you are going somewhere in an emergency, you have to take you have to take a cab, and let's say the first cab driver is charging a little higher, and you already know this, but still you don't have an option, right? So because it's an emergency, you will take that cab even knowing that it's expensive, right? But, and I also gave you this example that if you're going for your exam and in the middle, during your way, on your way, you realize that you have left your calculator at home, you'll still need to, you have to buy that thing before you go to the examination hall. So you would not mind paying or buying a new calculator. But if it's normal day at school and you have gotten your calculator at home, I mean, you might not buy that product knowing that, what's the point, right? You can uh, share your calculator with someone else in the class and so on, right? So students, are you getting me? Right? So how much urgent is something? That's one thing. Number of substitutes the product has. So when there are more substitutes, it's more elastic. When you have less substitutes, it's less elastic. Necessity versus luxury, right? Then, proportion of income spent on the good. So if you're spending a big proportion of your income on something, as I gave you some examples, right? Like a phone versus something as a ball pen, right? So I will be definitely concerned about how much money I'm spending on fuel, right? So increase in fuel prices is a concern for me, but increase in chocolate prices perhaps is not a very much concern for me. Students, are you getting me? Technically, I consume both things. I consume chocolate, I consume fuel, but a rise in the price of fuel will be of more concern to me compared to rise in the price of ice cream or rise in the price of chocolate, because I mean, just imagine how much income does that take. 10 rupees, 15 rupees, 20 rupees, right? 30 rupees. But just imagine that for 1 liter of fuel, which is costing in Pakistan around 150 rupees, right? So that's already very expensive. And then you need a couple of liters of fuel to ensure that you can travel to work, come back from work, go to some other places where you need to, right? So since I'm spending more proportion of income on fuel, that's more of concern to me compared to chocolate and stuff like that. So if it's more proportion, it's more elastic because then I'll spend my money wisely. More income spent on something, it's more elastic, right? Less income spent on something, it's less elastic. Everyone clear on this? Any confusion so far? Right? More income, more elastic, less income, less elastic. Right? If we are good, we can move on. Okay. Now, after knowing how do we calculate the price elasticity of demand, what is more elastic, what is less elastic, and all that stuff. Now, let's do an example. And in this, what we will see is that how through a graph can we tell whether the demand is more elastic or less elastic. So let's say I make two demand curves over here, right? Now you have to tell me that out of this blue and pink demand curve, which of the two is more elastic and which of the two is less elastic. Yeah, so you have price on the y-axis, so you have price of the good on the y-axis, and you have quantity demanded on the x-axis, like always, right? Now, can you tell me that which of the two do you think is more elastic and which of the two is less elastic? Yeah, in short term, as people find hard in changing their spending pattern. Okay, Zuhan, so to answer your question, Zuhan is saying that in short run, number of substitutes will not affect price elasticity of demand because it takes some time for people to adjust to, all these substitutes. So the answer to that question is perhaps yes, right? But that depends, totally depends on, consumers own style. It depends on how they behave, how they react. But yeah, I totally got your point, and it does make sense that in the short run it might be difficult for people to switch their spending pattern because I mean, they don't want to, or they perhaps don't know about all these other options. Yeah, that's correct. Okay, pink is more elastic, blue is more elastic. Information can also be affected. Yeah, information is very important. Yeah, so if you have information and if it's convenient for you to switch, then you'll definitely switch. John, so that is the complete answer to your question. So if people do have information about other substitutes and and it's easy to switch, right? Then they'll definitely switch. So it's not like I'm in US, cigarettes over there are expensive, and Pakistan cigarettes are cheap. So if there is no way for me to get, cigarettes from Pakistan to US, then obviously it will be like technically that option doesn't exist. But if it's convenient, right? So in one city, let's say it's expensive. I mean, that's why it never happens in one city of Pakistan. Cigarettes are more expensive compared to another city, and it's easy to take this product from one country to, so from one city to another. Then obviously it will be more elastic because you have technically option available. Great, perfect. Okay, now think about this, students. So to answer this question, that which of the two demand curves, let's say we label this as A and we label this as B, right? The blue and the pink, right? Now, let's say initially the price is the same for both the products. So let's say initially the price is same for both the goods. So when the price was, let's say $10 per unit, right? So when the price of this item, whatever this item was, is $10 per unit, so you can see for yourself that for both demand curves, the total quantity demanded was somewhere over here. The total quantity demanded was, let's say, 100 units. Let's make it simple, right? Now, when the price increased from, or let's say decreased. So when the price decreased from, let's say, 100 to $6, so the price has decreased for both the products by the same extent from $10 to $6. Now the quantity for A changed from 100 to 120. Yes or no? So the quantity for A changed how much? From 100 to 120. Whereas the quantity for B changed by how much? The quantity for B changed this much. So for which of the two products was there a greater change in quantity? Is it? So for which of the two curves or which of the two products, A or B, was there a greater change in demand? What do you think? Because for the same change in price, so the price is the same. So price changes, price dropped from 10 to $6. But for the curve A, for the blue curve, right, there was only a change of 20 units. So your demand increased from 100 to 120. Whereas for curve B, product B, your demand increased or changed from 100 to 150. So there's much greater change in demand for B compared to A. So that is why, and we know when there's greater change, it's known as more elastic. So B is more elastic in this case and A is less elastic. Is it? Did you get this? So B is more elastic. Now, I will also tell you after this an easier way to determine. Let me share with you an easier way to determine that which curve is more elastic and which curve is less elastic, right? So whichever of the two demand curves is steep, that's what? That's less elastic because there will be less change. There is less change. Whichever of the two demand curve is steep. Do you know what steepness is? Right? So have a look at this. This was steep, right? So just imagine you're driving your car up this hill. So if you're driving your car up this hill, which is B, compared to you driving your car, or let's say you're hiking. So a person is hiking this way on B, right? So I mean, it is upward hike, but not that difficult. As opposed to if someone is hiking on this graph A, just imagine it's a very steep slope, right? So that is what steepness is. Easy? Any confusion so far? Anything that anyone is not concerned about, anything not clear about, right? So compared to this, compared to the pink graph, if you compare hiking up on this A, right? I mean, it's much more of a hike. Yes or no? Right? So A is steep and B is less steep, right? So A is steep and B is less steep. Right. So I just told you that more elastic would be less steep. More elastic would be, more elastic would be, more elastic would be right. So out of these two, we can clearly tell that this blue one is less steep. A1 is less steep. So A is more elastic, and B is steep. So B is more elastic. So A is more elastic and B is less elastic. Any confusion about this? Anything that's not clear? Anything you want to ask me? Right? So what do we understood out of this? That steepness is inversely steepness, more steep, less elastic. So if the graph is more steep, then it means it's less elastic and vice versa. More steep means less elastic and vice versa, right? So this was steep, this is less elastic, this was not so steep, it's more elastic. Clear? Right. I mean, so I'm writing it on a whiteboard. So I definitely have notes around this, so you don't need to worry about it. The notes that you can find on our website, right? Mega Lecture, www.megalecture.com. So you will find all the notes about this topic. But yeah, so today's class will be available on the YouTube, so you can go and watch it whenever you want to. But I haven't made the notes because it was more of a conceptual thing rather than writing anything down and so on, right? Is it making sense? But this entire lecture will be available on a YouTube channel. Okay, any confusion so far, students? Are we good on this? Okay, any other questions coming to your mind? Anything not clear about the calculations and everything? Okay, perfect. So if this is clear, then what we'll do next is that we'll talk about unique cases of price elasticity. So in tomorrow's class, we'll talk about unique cases of price elasticity of demand, right? So far we have only discussed two cases, more elastic, less elastic. So in tomorrow's class, we'll talk about unique cases of price elasticity of demand, in which we'll talk about, in which we'll technically talk about that, what are some other cases apart from these two. No, Zohan, that's a different category altogether. So income and cross elasticity of demand is something that we'll discuss after this, but we are still within PED, we are still within the scope of price elasticity of demand. So in this, there are some unique cases, right? So if you remember, perfectly inelastic or perfectly elastic. So these are some special cases of price elasticity of demand that we'll discuss tomorrow, right? But anything that anyone was not clear with today, right, Khadija? Right? So do remember the shapes, do remember the formula, the calculation that we did. If there is any confusion, you can ask me tomorrow. And the factors that we discussed, these are also very important, right? And then tomorrow we'll build on this knowledge to talk about the unique case of price elasticity of demand and then move forward from there.